you for coming. This is Khadro, and she will be speaking with us about Buddhism. And she was born in California and began learning Buddhism in Dharamsala, India in 1973. She was ordained as a Buddhist the following year, and she has studied Buddhism with many great masters, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and Lama Yishi, and began teaching in 1979. She has taught in many countries around the world and is the author of several books, How to Meditate, Awakening the Kind Heart, and Preparing for Death, and Helping the Deaf and Dying. So thank you all for being here and welcome.
I was just going to say one thing real quick.
Yeah.
For the people in the audience, I have a little microphone when we get to the question and answers that I'll kind of be holding
Perfect.
above you, just so you know what that's about. It's for the live stream. So.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
So, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, if you don't, I do have a microphone here I can use. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And I'm very happy to be here to have the chance to give this talk. And this is like a huge topic. So I'll just I'll share some things that I know, and we'll leave some time at the end for you to ask questions. I presume some of you are working in hospice as doctors, nurses, palliative care, volunteers, and so on. So you probably have more experience than I do in working with dying people. I had a little bit in the 90s. I was living in Singapore. I was there for 11 years teaching Buddhism at a Buddhist center. And pray for today is some perspectives on death and dying from Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. There are different traditions of Buddhism, you might know. I'm not familiar with all of them. I know a little bit, but my main knowledge and experience is with Tibetan Buddhism. And by the way, I live in a monastery, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery near Newport, Washington. So it's about 45, 50 minutes from here. And you're all welcome to come and visit. It's a beautiful place. We have about 25 people living there. Most of them are ordained nuns, a few monks, and we have a lot of visitors coming and going. Okay, so first of all, what Buddhism says about death and dying. So I made a handout. I was too busy to put together slides, so we'll just go through the points in the handout. So for one thing is Buddhism says that death is a inevitable and natural part of life, and that might seem obvious, but I have heard of some religions, or at least some religious teachers, who talk about death as a kind of failure, a punishment. I mean, that's really tragic, you know. Somebody's dying and they have this idea that they're being punished for wrongdoings, that bad things they've done. I mean, that just makes the whole situation much more difficult. And so Buddhism doesn't say that at all. Buddha talked a lot about death and dying. I have a few quotes here from him. And the emphasis is on accepting death as a natural, inevitable part of life, and also part of nature. It's just part of our world. Everything in in Buddhism, it's important to accept and be aware of death. And actually, the Buddha advised us to meditate on death and be mindful, have mindfulness of death. And there are two reasons for this. One is that awareness of death will help us be more careful about our actions. Because the way that we live our life will affect the way that we die. I think there's a lot of examples of that, illustrations of that, and I think it's only natural that we would like to be in a positive state of mind when we die, rather than full of fear, anger, other painful, disturbing emotions, but be able to be peaceful and calm and accepting, and even have positive emotions, feeling love and compassion and fearlessness, courage about what's coming. To be able to be in such a state of mind at the time of death, we need to live our life in certain ways. And Buddhism has the view of karma, which is very similar to the ethical views of other religions, even if they don't use the word karma. But the actions that we do bring about results that we will experience in the future. Like in the Bible, it says, what you reap, what you sow, you will reap. You reap what you sow. So it's basically that idea. And so the idea is to live our life in such a way that we do good, we try to help people as much as we can, and we try to avoid negative actions that cause harm and problems to others. So living an ethical life. I'll talk more about that later. Emphasize in living a life on the Buddhist with the awareness that we're going to die. It will enable us to be more positive and negative thoughts, and how to have more positive thoughts like love and compassion. So we need to work on that while we're alive to be able to do that at the time of death. Otherwise, there's a good chance that our mind will be overwhelmed by these disturbing thoughts and emotions, and we won't know what to do, how to manage them. So if we learn how to manage our mind during our life, then death will be easy. So we need to start by learning to accept death rather than avoiding it, which is what a lot of people do. They just try to avoid the whole thought of death and live their life as if they're going to be here forever. So that's not wise from the Buddhist point of view. And then a third point here is that death isn't necessarily a bad experience, and it doesn't help to be afraid of it. So probably the reason people are afraid of death is because they think it's going to be awful. And that isn't necessarily the case. It really depends on whether or not we prepare for it. And I can say that with confidence because I was with my mother when she passed away, which was about 11 years, no, 15 years ago. Yeah, so I was really fortunate that I was with her for the last couple of weeks of her life. She died at home of cancer, and I was able to give whatever assistance I could to her. And I was just kind of amazed at how positive she was. She didn't show the slightest bit of fear or clinging to her family, to her possessions. She didn't show any anger, any unhappiness about the fact that she was dying. She was completely accepting and ready to go, and even cheerful, and even loving, showing love to the people around her. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I really think it's because she had a very deep faith in God, because I've heard other stories as well of people who were very accepting of death, calm in the face of death, even able to give love and give energy to the people around them rather than, being all afraid and sucking energy from people. So it doesn't have to be a bad experience, and being afraid of death doesn't help. Again, if we accept that we're going to die and live our life with that awareness, try to be the best person we can, live the best life we can, learn how to work with our mind and other spiritual practices that I'll talk about later, then death can be quite a even positive experience. There was one woman I knew, and before she died, she knew she was going to die. So the last 6 months of her life was like a retreat. She just really focused on spiritual practice. And at one point, she wrote a letter to her teacher, who's also my teacher, saying, "This is the best time of my life. This is the happiest experience of my life." So it was like, more positive and peaceful. And then a fourth point, this is more to do with the Buddhist view of things. Through practice, we can attain the deathless state, free from sorrow. So the Buddha was once an ordinary person like ourselves, going through the same kind of experiences in life that we have. And it was actually an encounter with death that motivated him to take up a spiritual life, spiritual practice. So he left his comfortable home, went into the forest and practiced meditation with the wish to reach a state that was beyond suffering, beyond sorrow, beyond confusion. And he was successful in doing that. It's what we call enlightenment or awakening. And then he realized that this is something everybody can do. Everybody can reach a state where they're beyond having to go through any kind of physical or mental suffering. And then he spent the remaining years of his life teaching the way to do that, how to attain that state. And so, as you may know, in Buddhism, we have the view of reincarnation. After somebody dies, they don't just go out of existence, but they are reborn. Their mind, their consciousness takes another life. And so we go through these cycles of death and rebirth again and again and again, according to our karma, the karma that we create. But eventually it is possible to break free of the situation and no longer have to go through death and rebirth, but be in a state that's completely peaceful and clear. So I'm just mentioning that because for Buddhists, someone on the Buddhist path, that's our ultimate goal. Our long-term goal is to get beyond death and rebirth and all the suffering involved. But in the meantime, we're working with our mind and helping others as much as we can. That's kind of the emphasis of the life of a Buddhist practitioner. So then there's a couple of quotes from the Buddha about impermanence, just illustrating how he did talk about it and emphasize the importance of it. So one quote says, "What is born will die." So every being that is born, everything that comes into existence will eventually go out of existence. That's just the natural situation of the world. What has been gathered will be dispersed. So people gather together for a meeting or a family dinner or a rock concert or a demonstration or whatever. We can't take any of those things with us when we do die and go to the next life. And we go shopping every week and buy a lot of groceries, but eventually they run out and we have to go again. So we accumulate things, but they eventually run out. What has been built up will collapse. So we build a lot of buildings and houses and bridges and so forth, but they too will not last forever. They may last for hundreds of years or thousands of years, but eventually they too will fall apart. And what has been high will be brought low. So people sometimes reach a level during their life of wealth, a high degree of wealth or a high degree of power or influence, but nobody is able to stay in a high position forever. People always eventually come down. They lose their money, they lose their job, they retire, or in the case of sports and entertainment and so on, someone who's the most replace them. So those are just examples of impermanence, the fact that nothing is permanent, nothing will be there forever, things are subject to change and eventually going out of existence. And another quote from the Buddha is, "Of all plowing in the autumn is supreme. Of all footprints, the elephant's is supreme. And of all perceptions, remembering death and impermanence is supreme." So in that quote, he's pointing out that various things we could really thought seriously about death. But having that encounter, that awareness of death, can have a powerful effect on them, motivating them to take interest in other matters than just this life and be on. People usually feel our mind doesn't really naturally gravitate towards that, and we experience kind of resistance, and also it brings up challenging feelings and memories and so on. But as we saw, it is important to meditate on death and not avoid it simply because we feel uncomfortable about it. And in fact, the more we meditate on death, the more we get familiar with death, the more comfortable we become with it. Yeah, I can definitely see that in my experience. Initially, you're not really afraid of it. But over time, with more practice, more familiarity, you become more at ease with it. That fear decreases. So it's useful to look at benefits of meditating on death, because these are like the pros, the positive effects we will have if we are mindful of and live with the awareness of death. So there's some here from the Buddhist texts in the Tibetan tradition. There's a list of 6 benefits. The first is your actions will become very beneficial. So being aware of death and how important it is to die with a positive mind and not a negative mind, and also without regrets. I think, a lot of people die with regret, looking back on their life and feeling regret for actions that they did that were harmful, or things that they wish they had done that they didn't do. And so it'd be nice to be able to die without those kind of regrets. And so awareness of death, awareness that this life is going to come to an end, will make us much more careful about what we do and avoid doing things we would regret later. And if we do make mistakes, at least try to clear them up as quickly as we can. And then really try to put our energy into things that are positive and constructive, that we feel good about. So at the time of our death, looking back on our life, we'll feel good about the way we live our life. So awareness of death helps us live our life better, in a more beneficial way. And the second benefit is your spiritual practice will become very powerful. So even those who do have an interest in spiritual practice, who are following Buddhism or Christianity or whatever religious tradition, we do regard this as something important. And in Buddhism, we do practice every day on our own. But without an awareness of death, it's easy to maybe just do your practice mechanically, automatically, running on automatic, and not really doing it in a heartfelt way with full awareness, full attention. And it's even possible for sort of ulterior motives to creep in, unskillful attitudes to come into your practice, where you may think, I'm a great practitioner, but in fact, there's things going on in your mind that aren't so ideal, so pure. So awareness of that we're going to come, the end of our life and then face what we did with our life will motivate us to be more careful about our actions, even our spiritual practice. And then the third is, it's important at the beginning of your practice. So for many people, it's what motivates them to start practicing in the beginning. I met this one he was still fairly young when I met him, and he told me that in his 20s he had cancer, and he said it was the best thing that happened to him in his life for 2 reasons. One was, while he was recovering from cancer, getting medical treatment, he needed to stay with his family. And up until that time, he hadn't been on such good terms with his family. I guess there were conflicts and so on. So during that period, he was able to resolve his problems, and he got along much better with his family members. So that was a very wonderful thing. And the second benefit was that he became interested in meditation and spiritual practice and started meditating. And then when I met him, he was on his way to becoming a monk, and then eventually entered a monastery in South India, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, where he's been studying now for many years. And last time I saw him, he looked so happy. He was radiant and very, very happy with his life. And so that encounter with a terminal illness, or what could have been a terminal illness, was what motivated him to get started on a spiritual practice. And many, many people have that experience as well. Even just thinking about death. I met somebody who told me that when he was 15 years old, he woke up in the middle of the night thinking, I'm going to die. We're all going to die. And he never thought about that before, but that was such a powerful thought for him. And it sent him to search for answers and solutions, and become interested in spiritual questions. So it's helpful to get us started in our practice, and then it's helpful in the middle of our practice, meaning to keep going. Because sometimes people get all enthusiastic about meditating or doing some other spiritual practice, but then after a while they lose it. The inner momentum runs out, and they find other things that are more interesting. So they may put it to the side. So to keep going in our practice, not give up. Because spiritual practice, again, is something that will benefit us at the time of death and afterwards, if you believe in that. And then the fifth point is it's important at the end of your practice. So that means to be able to bring us all the way to the end, which in Buddhism is this state of nirvana, or awakening, enlightenment, being free of all suffering. Being free of having to die and take rebirth and experience problems and suffering. So we need a lot of energy to get all the way to that goal. So awareness of death can give us that energy to keep going. And then the sixth point is you will die with a peaceful, happy mind, free of regrets. So if we do live our life with this awareness of our mortality, the fact that we're not going to be here forever, and use that in a constructive way to live our life wisely and compassionately, be the best person we can, then when we do come to the end of our life, we'll be able to be in peace, have a peaceful state of mind, even a happy state of mind, and be free of regrets. So I think that's something that should appeal to everybody. When I was living in Singapore, I was invited to give a talk at a hospice, and they had organized a seminar for the volunteers who were helping with dying patients. And they invited members of the four main religions that are found in Singapore: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam. And so I was representing Buddhism, and each of the representatives of the different religions gave a talk about how death is viewed in their particular religion, and what is important when helping somebody die who's dying, who is a follower of that religion. And I was really delighted to hear we were all basically saying the same thing, that it's important for the dying person to be in a peaceful state of mind, to remember the religious beliefs, the religious practices, not be afraid, not be clinging to this life, their property and possessions and family and so on, but willing to let go. And so differences according to the different religions on what that means and how to do it. But basically the bottom line was help the person to be in a positive state of mind, and remember, if they are religious, if they do have religious beliefs and practices, to remind them of those, encourage them to keep those in their mind, not be afraid, and so on. So I think, yeah. And even for people who don't follow any particular religion, if you were to ask them, how would you like your mind to be at the time of death? I think everybody would say, I want to be peaceful. I want to be happy. I don't want to be miserable and scared and angry and clinging and regretful and so on. So I think it's just natural that we want that state of mind as we are dying. So then it's just a question of how to do that, how to get there. And being aware of death, accepting death, will definitely help us to do that, to prepare ourselves. So that list of 6 benefits is from Buddhist texts, as I say. And I was looking on the internet the other day, and I found another list of benefits from website, positivepsychology.com. And it was an article, the link is there if you want to look it up, specifically about Maranasati. So Maranasati is a Pali term, and sati means mindfulness. That's very well known. And Marana is about death. So mindfulness of death. So that's the term in Buddhism for meditation on death or mindfulness of death. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. I'll share a few here. But this article mentioned a list of benefits, some of which I think were the result of research. I didn't have the time to look up these articles, but if you are interested, you can. So one benefit is a deeper appreciation of impermanence that reduces the suffering of attachment and emotional reactivity to change. So by meditating on or contemplating or just being mindful of the fact that our life will end at some point, will help us be more accepting of impermanence, the changing nature, because impermanence is happening every day, every minute, every second of our life. It isn't just something that happens at the end of our life, but our body is constantly changing. All the things in the world around us are constantly changing. Impermanence is just a fact of life. And being more aware of it and more accepting of it reduces the suffering of attachment, because people tend to get attached to other people, to themselves, their bodies, to their possessions, and so on. And that's what leads to suffering. That's probably the main suffering that people have when they come to the end of their life. They feel, I don't want to go. I don't want to leave all this behind. I don't want to have to say goodbye to my friends and relatives and my possessions. So it's attachment, which is a big topic in Buddhism, recognizing attachment. It could also be called clinging or craving. It's something we all have. It's like instinctive. And yet it's not something permanent in the sense that we don't have to have it. It's not we're not hardwired to have attachment. It's possible to overcome attachment, or at least reduce attachment and learn to let go. So that's actually a big part of Buddhist practice, is learning to deal with attachment, lessen our attachment. And it's very helpful to start doing that while we're still alive and not wait till the last minute, because then it'll be much harder. So if we learn to reduce our attachment now, then that will reduce the suffering that comes when we do have to separate from, say goodbye to, leave behind people and other things. So anyway, there's a paper regarding that. And the second benefit is an increased sense of gratitude for each moment of our precious human life. So Buddhism says that human life, being human being, is very, very precious. We're very fortunate to be human beings as opposed to animals who have much more difficulty than we do, and less opportunity to develop their minds. They don't have the ability to understand things that we can understand. So Buddhism says if you have a human life, you're very fortunate, but use it well. Don't just be complacent about it, but use your human life, develop your potential, develop your capacity for understanding things, developing wisdom, being compassionate, helping others, and so on. And so understanding that this life isn't going to last forever. We have a limited amount of time, gives increased impetus to use our life well while we have it and not waste it, not be lazy. And then number 3, an enhanced appreciation of human vulnerability that leads to greater compassion for self and others. So that's another thing that we can learn by contemplating and being aware of death. We realize we are all subject to death and dying. And that will enhance our compassion for others, hopefully. Understanding that, yeah, this is something that we all have to go through, and then use that to increase our compassion and our love and our empathy and our wish to benefit others. And then number 4, a diminished anxiety about death, the death of our loved ones and dying in the world around us. Yeah, so the more we contemplate and make ourselves familiar with death and dying, that will decrease our anxiety, our fear, and enable us to be more comfortable with death, which will help us in preparing for our own death. But also, before we die, there will be people in our life who will die, family members and friends. And if we can be more comfortable with death, we'll be able to be more helpful to them. Otherwise, what often happens when a loved one dies, the people around them, because they haven't come to terms with death themselves, then they feel anxiety, and sometimes they even avoid that person. I heard one very sad story of a young woman, I think she was in her early 30s, who was diagnosed with terminal illness, and her friends disappeared. Yeah, I mean, the time she most needed her friends, they weren't there for her, which is understandable, because when you're in your early 30s, you don't want to be thinking about death. You're thinking about, getting married, having kids, your career, and they probably just didn't know what to say, how to be with her, how to deal with her. So yeah, that's very, very sad. And it's probably sad for them as well that they didn't know how to deal with their friend who was dying and maybe felt regret afterwards. So it's very helpful for us in preparing for our own death, but also being able to help others who are dying, if we can come to terms with it and be more comfortable with it. And then the 5th, a reduced fear of our own death, which can help us die in a state of peace rather than agitation. So that's from a book, Stephen Levine. Stephen Levine, he passed away, but he, for many years, he was a Buddhist meditator, and he worked a lot with dying people and wrote a number of books on how to help people who are dying. So he's kind of one of the pioneers in that field. So anyway, I hope it's clear that being mindful of death, meditating on death is beneficial, even though initially it makes us squirm. We're not too comfortable about it, happy about it. But if we can get over those initial resistances, then there will be these benefits. So I'll just share an experience I had. I started learning Buddhism when I was pretty young, about 21. I went to India and studied in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama lives, and also in Nepal. And I was attending my first meditation course in Nepal. And it was a month-long course, quite intensive, lots of meditations and talks and discussions during the day. And one night we were sitting, we didn't have a nice building, in this tent, this kind of very funky old tent sitting on the ground. and the teacher was guiding a meditation, and there was an earthquake all of a sudden. And I had never experienced an earthquake before, so the ground was shaking, and we were up on a hill, and the area around us, there were villages, farms and so on, and we could hear people screaming and dogs barking and kids crying. And the teacher all of a sudden said in a very serious voice, he said, meditate on bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the state of mind of compassion and love and wanting to benefit others and wanting to become awakened to benefit others. And when I heard him say that, my instant thought was, we're going to die. And I couldn't think about compassion or love or bodhicitta. I was just terrified. I went into a state of panic. It was a horrible, horrible experience, just sheer panic at the thought that I was now going to die. And I hadn't realized that before. I didn't think I was afraid of death. Whenever I thought about death, I thought, oh, well, no big deal. You just die and that's it. Nothing to worry about. So this brought me face to face with the fact that I was afraid of death. I wasn't ready for death. And a few minutes, or I don't know how long, it seemed like an eternity, maybe just a few seconds, the earth stopped shaking and we were still okay. We didn't die. So there's this great sense of relief. But that experience really left me with a sense of how important it was to be prepared for death. I realized I was not ready for death, and I definitely didn't want to die in that state of mind, of panic and not knowing what to do and not knowing how to manage it. So this idea of meditating on death and preparing myself for death became very, very important for me. So then how to do it? The next point. So there are different ways of practicing mindfulness of death. This term maranasati is a Pali term. So I've just given a selection of methods here, but there are others as well. So one way, and this is actually from a website, I gave the resource down below, Maranasati for the Modern World. It's on the website of the Insight Meditation Society. So there's a selection of different ways of doing meditation on death. So this is like a simple one. Breathe in and out as if it is your last breath. So a lot of people do meditation on breathing. It's one of the main ways of practicing mindfulness, which has become very popular, very well known, many people practicing it. And it's also good because you don't have to have any religious beliefs in order to practice mindfulness. So you can be completely secular, you can belong to any religion. And it's just a really helpful way of calming down the mind and becoming more aware of what's going on in your mind so that you can catch if there are disturbing thoughts and emotions that could carry you away into some very negative state. So you can catch those and let go of them or deal with them before that happens. So it's a very helpful way of keeping yourself balanced, keeping yourself in a good state of mind. And so, yeah, probably the most common way of practicing mindfulness is using the breath, just being aware of the breath coming in and going out. So this is one of the easiest, probably, methods of meditation taught in Buddhism. And so sometimes, at least, you can just bring in that awareness of death, that what happens when we die, there will come a time when we breathe out and we don't breathe in again, or we breathe in and we don't breathe out again. So death could happen, you know, in the middle of one breath or between one breath and another. So just to have that awareness that, yeah, at some point we will have a final breath and not another one after that. So again, initially we may find that idea very frightening, But if we get used to it, if we get familiar with it, then it's a helpful way of preparing ourselves for that point. Not take the breath for granted. You know, we can easily just think, I'm going to breathe forever. But that isn't the case. You know, there will come a time when we won't breathe again. And so this is one way of bringing in the awareness of death to our life and our practice. So it says, breathe in and out as if it is your last breath. Particularly notice the end of the out breath, feeling it slip away to nothing, resting in the gap. When another in-breath begins, renew the perception that it is your last. So I would probably take some practice to get to the point of being able to do that, but that is something helpful. In the Tibetan tradition, I've heard my teachers say that one way we can bring awareness of death into our daily life is when we wake up in the morning to remind ourselves, oh, I'm still alive. Not take that for granted, because there are people who die in their sleep, people who go to sleep and then don't wake up in the morning. I know a couple of people that happened to, and they were not old, they were in their early 40s, and they were not suffering from any serious illness. They were healthy, but they just died in their sleep. So apparently it's rare, but it does happen. And so that's always a possibility that, yeah, we go to sleep at night and don't wake up in the morning. And so if we do wake up in the morning, we find ourselves still alive, still in this body, still in this life, to feel joyful about that, to feel grateful for that. And then to resolve to use this day well, you know, to be a good person, do my spiritual practice, help others as much as I can, try to avoid harming others. So that's something we can contemplate when we first wake up in the morning. And then in a similar way, when we get to the end of the day, we're about to go to sleep, to think, oh, I didn't die today. I could have. Lots of other people died today, but I didn't. I made it through another day. How fortunate that is. And then again, feel grateful for the life that we have. So, and I heard or read kind of interesting practice. I think it was a man in Burma who in the morning would get up and do some practice, some meditation, some prayers and so on. And then he would take his prayer beads. So Buddhists use prayer beads. And then he would count off one prayer bead for each person that he knew, and think to himself, that person is going to die, that person is going to die, that person is going to die, and so on. Go through all the people he knew. And I'm sure he did that for himself as well. I'm going to die too. And I thought, that's a very interesting practice. I haven't heard of anyone doing that, but it's perhaps something he just came up with on his own. But I think if we have that awareness that the people in our life, especially the people we really care about, they are not going to be here forever. They are not going to last forever. That will enable us to appreciate them much more and treat them well instead of being nasty to them, unkind to them, or indifferent, uncaring, ignoring them. That came so clear when I was with my mother those last 3 weeks of her life, knowing that, you know, she was going to disappear very soon. I just felt this amazing love, more love than I ever felt in my life for anybody. It was such a beautiful experience, just knowing, you know, there was just a short amount of time I was still able to enjoy her presence in this world. And so I think, yeah, if we realize that, even though a person may still live for another decade or 2 or 3 or 4, it's still limited. The amount of time we have to enjoy that person's presence in our life is limited. And if we realize that, we'll be much more appreciative of them, grateful to them, loving and caring towards them. And even if we do get into some kind of problem or conflict with them, we'll want to clear it up as quickly as possible and not leave it there. Because I heard another very sad story of a mother who got into an argument with her son just before the son and his father left on a fishing trip. And so the mother and the son were arguing, and then the son left. They were still angry at each other. And then the son didn't come home. There was some kind of accident that happened on this fishing trip, and he died. So I think you can imagine how terrible the mother must have felt. I mean, it's bad enough to lose a child. That must be the most painful experience anybody could have. But then on top of that, the last interaction she had with her son was an angry one. And they didn't have a chance to make up, hug, tell each other how much they loved each other. So that could happen to any of us, you know, when we part with somebody. Even we think it's only going to be for a few minutes or a few hours or a few days, but there's always that possibility that we may not see them again. And if we have that awareness, we will really be the best person we can to them, show our love for them, our appreciation for them, and not leave any problems unresolved. Which some people do. They have arguments, they don't resolve them, and then they drag on for years and years and years, and pretty soon the other person's gone or you're gone, and you never had a chance to clear that up. And that can be a cause for a lot of suffering, a lot of regret at the time of death. So anyway, another way to bring awareness of death into our life is when friends or relatives die, consciously think, I too will die. And there's a quote from a sutra, one of the teachings of the Buddha, where a man is asked, good man, didn't it occur to you, an intelligent and mature person, I too am subject to death? I am not exempt from death. Let me now do good by body, speech, and mind. The man must sheepishly answer, no, I was heedless. Reflect for yourself on the certainty of your death and how you would like to live. Yeah, so when we hear of death of others, or we see a, what are they called, hearse, or pass a cemetery, so when we encounter the deaths of others, it's helpful to remind ourselves, I am subject to that as well. That is going to happen to me one day. I am not beyond that. And then use that to reflect on how to live our life in that awareness, how to be the best person we can be in our life. Another meditation taught by the Buddha is to contemplate how our body is made of parts that are constantly in flux, changing moment by moment, getting older, wearing down, and subject to death. So the Buddha particularly taught that to his closest disciples, the monks and nuns who were living with him in the forest and like full-time meditators. There's still many who live that way. Yeah, so that's a very important meditation, just to contemplate that this body isn't something solid and permanent. It's made of many parts. We know that from anatomy, from science, but just to contemplate that, contemplate how the body is made of parts, organs and blood and bones and skin, and on a subtler level, cells, molecules, atoms. And all these parts of the body are not fixed and frozen and static, but they're constantly changing. And as they change, they're not getting younger. Our body doesn't get younger. Like that film, was it Benjamin Button? Oh, that was weird. But yeah, the rest of us, you know, our bodies are getting older as time goes on, day by day, moment by moment. And just to have that awareness, to live with that awareness that this body is impermanent, subject to change, and eventually will pass away. So that really helps us reduce attachment to our body and unhappiness when changes do happen in our body. We start to see more wrinkles and gray hairs, and things are not working as well as they used to. Instead of being upset about that, just accepting, well, that's just the natural course of things. And this is something we all have to go through, not just me. So it also helps us have more understanding, empathy, and compassion for others. And then there's this meditation. I'll just go through it quickly because we're running out of time. It's in our tradition, the Tibetan tradition, the 9-point meditation on death. So I just have it here quickly. If you're interested, you can find more about it in websites online. So there are 3 main points, and then each of those has 3 points to contemplate, making 9 altogether. So the first main point is that death is definite, which may seem obvious, but still we need to think about it. So the 3 points to contemplate there is that everybody has to die. So death is something that happens to everybody. We can think about people in the past, all the people who lived in this world in the past and how they all had to die, and all the people who are in the world right now eventually will die, and that means me as well. I too will have to die. And then second, our lifespan is constantly decreasing. So time goes by every day, hour, minute, second, and as time goes by, we are getting closer to death. So I find it helpful to think of an hourglass. When you turn it over, there's a certain number of sand grains in the top, and they're falling down continuously, and eventually they're gone. So our life is like that. We have a certain amount of time to live, and it's, decreasing all the time. It's running out. Time is running out for us. That's not to make us frightened, but just to make us think carefully, how do I want to live my life? What's the best way to live my life? And then the third point, the amount of time we have for spiritual practice is small. So if we do see the value of doing spiritual practice, we shouldn't postpone it and think, I'll do it later when the kids are grown up and I'm retired and I have lots of time. We don't know if that time will come. And then the second main point is the time of death is indefinite, meaning there's no certainty when death will happen. We don't know. There's no fixed lifespan. Every human being is guaranteed a certain number of years and then they will die. It's not like that. People die at all different ages, from infancy to over 100. Some people live to be 110, 15, 20, very rare, but yeah. So there's just no certainty about how many years we will have. And then there are many causes of death, many ways that death happens, mainly illness, but also lots of different accidents. And even you're just walking down the street. Yeah, some people just walking and they can be hit by a car or something falls on them. So it's all very uncertain how much time we have and when it's going to end, how it's going to end. And then our body and life are fragile. I think this a good illustration of that is COVID, which when you think about it, it's tiny, microscopic. You can't even see it with the naked eye, and yet it caused the death of millions of people. So it doesn't take much. It doesn't take something huge for death to happen. And then the third point is only spiritual practice will help at that time. So this is something we need to contemplate. What is going to help us at the time of death? Loved ones, they can help to a certain extent. They can help us be more comfortable. They can hold our hand. They can speak comforting words to us. But at a certain point, we're going to separate from them. As we are dying, we lose our ability to see, to hear, to speak. And we go, according to Buddhism, we go into our own mind and have our own experiences that other people can't share with us. They can't know what we're going through. And actually in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a whole explanation of the process of dying. 8 different stages that you go through as you're dying. And these are all things that happen within yourself, within your own mind. And so this is something we go through alone. Nobody can go with us. No one can share it with us. So the point there is to realize we need to learn how to manage our own mind and not always rely on other people or other things to help us be in a positive state of mind. And then wealth and possessions can't help. We leave those behind, so that can help us lessen our attachment to them. And our body cannot help. As we're dying, our body is gradually shutting down, unable to function. And so we can't rely on our body. We can't run away from death. We can't fight death physically. So the only thing that can really help us is our mind, knowing how to work with our mind. And that's really the essence of Buddhism, is learning about the mind, our thoughts, our emotions, and how to work with our mind to keep our mind in a good state, even in difficult situations like dying. And that's really, that's what spiritual practice is all about in Buddhism. So then I just mentioned a few possible spiritual practices that can help us prepare for death. Living ethically, being as kind and compassionate as possible, doing what's helpful for others, not doing harmful things. That's basically what ethics is about in Buddhism. So if we live that way, again, we'll have less to regret at the time of death. We'll be able to die peacefully and with a positive state of mind. And number 2, studying spiritual teachings. So it's very helpful to, in addition to other things that you read and study, to study teachings of the great masters who had wisdom, compassion, and gave advice on how to deal with difficult situations in life, such as sickness and death and loss and so on. And then number 3, devotional practices. These do exist in Buddhism. Not everybody is comfortable with them. They're not for everybody, but some people like them, and they can be very helpful. Prayers, mantras, so things that we can recite as we are dying, that can really help us to keep our mind calm and not be overwhelmed by fear, other disturbing emotions. Number 4, mindfulness. So that enables us to just be aware of what is going on in our mind and notice if there are disturbing thoughts or emotions that could take over, hijack our mind, take our mind into a very unpleasant state. So learning how not to let that happen, because those thoughts and emotions are impermanent. They come and go. If we can just watch them come and go, we don't have to buy into them and get carried away by them. And then last is meditation on loving kindness and compassion. So these, we all have love and compassion. These are natural human qualities, but we can enhance them. We can develop them more, make ourselves more familiar with them. And if we are able to have those in our mind as we are dying, then that naturally means our mind is in a positive state. And that will be beneficial for ourselves to be in a positive state of mind, also beneficial for others. I've recently been corresponding with a man whose wife passed away not too long ago, and he was quite upset by the fact, well, of course, losing your wife is difficult, but apparently she was quite frightened and disturbed as she was dying, and it was painful for him to see that. And he really felt he doesn't want to be like that himself when he's dying, because it causes the people around to be unhappy and worried. So that motivated him to start learning meditation and learning ways of working with the mind, because he wants to be able to die peacefully and give reassurance and confidence to the people around him, rather than causing them to be worried and upset. So, yeah. So if we can have love and kindness in our mind as we are dying, then that will be beneficial for ourselves, but also for the people around us. Maybe some of you read the book Tuesdays with Maury, and they made a nice film about it as well. So that's a great example of someone who is so loving and kind and radiating it out to the people around him, giving energy to the people around him, even though he's the one who was dying. But he was in this amazing positive state of mind, and it's because of the way he lived his life. He'd been like that all his life with his family, his friends, his students, and so on. So that's a good illustration of how the way we live our life will affect the way that we die. Okay, so I went a little over time, but I have a lot to say. So if there's any questions.
Could you,
Oh, did you want the microphone?
okay.
It's silly looking, but it works.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit about how we could best support a Buddhist who came on services, whether they're inpatient unit or home services?
Well, it might be helpful because, as I mentioned, there are different forms of Buddhism. So it might be helpful to try to find out what type of Buddhist that person is, and if there's any temple or center or practitioner in the area of that particular form of Buddhism, then because, for example, if the person is from Thailand and they follow Thai Buddhism, then, I mean, there's many things we have in common, but if there was someone from that tradition that could be called in to help them, they could communicate with, then that would be one thing. I don't know, that's probably not too likely in this area, though. I don't think there's too many Buddhist temples or Buddhist. But yeah, to somehow make a connection between that person and someone from that tradition, a teacher, a monk, a nun, practitioner. So that's one thing. And if that isn't possible, if that isn't available, then yeah, try to find out what kind of practices the person may have done, and then ask them if they would like help, assistance in doing those practices, like practicing them with the person. For example, even though I'm a Buddhist, but if I was with somebody who was a Catholic who's dying, like that was my mother, she was a Catholic. So I wouldn't talk about Buddhism, I wouldn't do Buddhist practices. So I would, well, what kind of practice do you do? Hail Mary? Do you want to recite some Hail Marys? Do them together. Help that person. So that's one thing you could try as well. If the person is a Zen practitioner, then meditate with them. Just sit quietly. I think probably the best thing is just to ask them if they are able to talk. Ask them what they would like, what would be helpful for them, rather than just assuming that. But I'm sure that's something that's done anyway. But we do have, just that you know, we do have a monastery not too far away. And yeah, people from the monastery would be very happy to come. That did actually happen. There was some family here in this area. There was a murder. No, somebody was shot, and I can't remember the whole story, but anyway, the mother of this son who had been shot in a bar or something like that asked if some people from the abbey could come and do prayers for the son. So people are happy to do that. So
What would you like at end of life for support, since you're a Tibetan Buddhist? And
yeah, well, that's one reason I'm living there. Because yeah, I feel it's very helpful to have others around who have the same beliefs, same worldview, doing similar prayers, and can give support, come in and talk, do prayers with you, do meditation with you, and so on. Yeah. So if I was living in a community where there were no other person around, who had the same beliefs, I would feel a little challenged. I mean, I want to be strong enough to practice on my own, but you just never know the circumstances of your death, and if you're going to be in pain or you're clouded with whatever confusion, and it may be difficult to do your own practices. And so, yeah, that's one of the purposes of the Abbey, because quite a few of us are in our 70s and getting older. And so just to have that supportive community for our physical needs as well as our spiritual needs. And also we make a will, not just a will regarding any personal property, but also spiritual will, what we would like done. So I did that over the last couple of years. I wrote it down, and it took a while to think about, what do I want people to do with me while I'm dying, after I die? What do I want done with my body? We actually got permission to make a cemetery there, so we can keep our remains there, which is a nice idea. So yeah, it is good for anybody at any age to think about those things and make a will, and also leave instructions with your family and friends about what you would like done when you pass away, who you would like to be informed, what, if any, prayers, practices, meditations you would like done. Does that answer your question?
So one of the things that we see in a lot of the care that we provide to people, of course, is that individualism is very important in decision making and in the way that people engage in their end of life experience. But we also find that different faith practices or different religious belief systems sometimes impacts the way that people make those decisions. So it's helpful sometimes to know, because I love the different information that you're sharing about the perspectives on death and mortality and the impermanence of life and those things. In the Buddhist faith belief, does that come into play often in the way that people approach, say, medical models of care, use of medications for managing symptoms at end of life, those kind of decisions that people are asked to make? And oftentimes, like with hospice, because we come in and we have these different ways that we approach managing symptoms, it doesn't, not everybody, because their faith background is always on board the same way that others might be.
Yeah, that's kind of complex, because, you know, most Buddhists in the world live in Asian countries, Thailand, Burma, Japan, and so on. And probably each country has their own legal issues and also practices when it comes to medication. I remember reading an article by somebody who had been living in Japan, and apparently doctors there are not very, don't frequently give pain medication. There's this idea that you just have to tough it out. Whereas in other countries like this country, you know, they're, you know, freely giving out pain medication. So some issues might be related to the society and the legal system, medical system, and so on. But that I'm often asked about medication for pain. And what I've understood, of course, it's individual. I've heard of some cases of practitioners who don't want any pain medication. They want to just use their meditation rather than medication to deal with pain. But I've also heard from some of my teachers that it is okay to take pain medication for pain. Ideally, we like our mind to be clear, to be able to still have awareness so that we can do our prayers and our practices and just have positive thoughts. So if the medication could be administered in such a way that the pain is diminished, but the mind is still clear. I think that's normally the case in hospice. That's I think what most people want. They don't want to be screaming in pain, but they still want to be conscious and alert as much as possible. And I understand it is possible to do that, to administer pain in that way. But yeah, I think it would be up to the individual person whether they want to take medication or not. I don't know if that's answering your question.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there's one answer to those kind of questions that would pervade all Buddhist traditions and all Buddhist practitioners. So it would be an individual thing.
I think I heard you say,
Microphone's coming.
operators.
Yeah.
I think I heard you mention that there's 8 stages that the dying person goes through.
Mhm.
when they're dying. That was not on this.
No, it's kind of complicated.
Is there somewhere that I could find that information? Or
I think you can find just about anything online. So I'm sure if you Google 8 stages of the dying process, you'll find information about it. It is in books. Yeah, the reason I didn't bring it up today because it has to do with physiology in Tibetan Buddhism. It isn't found in other traditions of Buddhism. It's in Tibetan Buddhism. And they talk about in our body, there are subtle channels. It's like in Hinduism, channels and chakras, and also energies, prana. And so the 8 stages has to do with changes in those. And also the mind going from a more coarse level, which is our normal everyday experiences of, sense perceptions and thoughts and so on. So those kind of gradually stop functioning, and the mind goes to more subtle states, down to what's called the clear light state of mind. That's the most subtle level of mind. So that happens on the 8th stage. And for a practitioner, that's a very important point, because if they can be aware during that 8th stage in the clear light, they can use the clear light mind to meditate and even reach enlightenment. Not easy to do, but it's still useful, even if you're not a practitioner, to have some understanding of these 8 stages. If you're with someone who's dying, you can observe them. And also, at least in this tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, also in Chinese Buddhism, it's considered ideal to not disturb a person while they're going through these stages and even afterwards, because the mind or the consciousness can remain within the body for several hours, even days after the breathing has stopped. And so the idea is to not disturb the body until there are signs that the mind has actually exited and left the body.
Interesting.
Yes. But there are these stories of people who appear to die, and they're even sometimes the body's even in the morgue, and then they wake up again. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's from the point of view of this tradition of Buddhism, that's because, even after the breath is stopped and there's no more signs of life, the mind or the consciousness could still be present in the body and could come out again, come back again. And so that's another reason to not disturb the body until you're sure that, they really have left.
And with that teaching or that mindset, is it common for someone who is Buddhist to, after they pass away, to have like a wake of some form, or a kind of a set or designated period of time that they try to leave the person's body and state and not disturb them?
That's definitely the case in Tibetan Buddhism, and I think also in Chinese Buddhism. I'm not so sure about the traditions of Buddhism in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, and so on. I don't know if they have that same awareness. So yeah, it'd be best to check with if you're dealing with a person from that tradition, to try to check with a monk, a teacher from that tradition, to find out what's customary.
And much of the time, we're the ones calling like the funeral home or things like that for the families. And so that's very helpful to know if someone does have Buddhist practices, for us to be able to kind of plan for that and know how we can support those people and maybe not do those things for them if they don't want us involved in that. So,
Yeah, and I knew some Buddhist friends in California who were part of a Buddhist center, and a number of years ago, one member of the community passed away. She was just in her 40s, but she had cancer, and she was at home when she died. And the members of the community stayed with her all through the 24 hours a day. They took turns staying with her, and they said it was actually 3 days from the time she stopped breathing to the time when they saw the signs that her mind had actually left. And so because she was at home, they could just leave the body there and didn't need to do anything. It's trickier if it's in a hospital. Hospitals have their rules about that, but yeah.
I sat in a presentation some years ago. It was given by a monk from the Gaden Shartse Monastery in India. It was on death and dying, and one of the things that he spoke of was that there are two aspects to the dying process. The first is about 3 days. It's for the body and the systems of the body and the mind to be clear and leave. But he said there's an additional 3 days for the spirit to make its leaving. And in that, his sense was to not disturb the body until the 7th day, and then you could do cremation on the 7th day. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he means by 2 phases. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
I guess another way to say it possibly is that there is a continuum of 6 days.
Yeah, yeah. But my understanding it also depends on the way death happens. 'Cause I was living in one community in Italy, and this man just suddenly had a heart attack and keeled over on the floor of the coffee shop. And he had a heart condition. It wasn't totally surprising, but it was shocking to everybody. And so, yeah, we gathered and did prayers and mantras and so on. And the resident Lama was away at that time, but when he came back the next day or so, he said that in the case of a heart attack, the whole process of dying goes very quickly. So we didn't need to wait for days. So I was kind of surprised to hear that. I was, that was new to me. But we still did keep the body for a few days in a cool room and continued doing prayers and so on before it was taken away. So yeah, that was for me helpful to know that, it isn't always 3 days. It could be longer. It could be shorter. Depends on various factors. So I think in the community, like if there's a monastery and there's Tibetan lamas and so on, they would have the most knowledge to know what to do, how to do it, when to do things, and so on. So we just do the best we can. Anyone else?
If you haven't already, please sign in and out. If you didn't grab the outline of the talk, grab one. And our next talk is June 21st.
Atheists
And none.
and nuns. Atheists and nuns. Oh, oh.
Not Catholic atheists.
Okay.